I think we might wait just a couple more minutes. I was across the way fighting with our printer. But I do have handouts of each slide for everybody with a notes page, so you'll be able to kind of take notes as we go. That should be here within 5 minutes. But let me start with introductions. I think I've met or know most of you. I'm Autumn Malanka. I work across the way with the Creeks Division. Today, the person presenting the presentation is Brandon Steets. He works here locally for Geosyntex Consultants. And it's actually his firm that helped us produce the city guidance manual, the Stormwater BMP guidance manual. So I wanted to start off with a little introduction to sort of get some questions answered right up front. Because the way that we're going to do the presentation today is Brandon's going to give the presentation through PowerPoint, and we want to hold questions until the end. During the last workshop that we had a couple weeks ago, we let people kind of interject with some questions, and it sort of slowed things up too much. And the presentation, the way it's structured, answers questions kind of as we go. I know that you're going to initially have some questions like, well, wait a second, what are the stormwater management program requirements? Be patient, we get to that. And then write your questions down or keep them in mind, and at the end we've allotted about half an hour or more for a question-answer session. So don't worry, we'll definitely address any and all questions that come up, and anything that we can't answer, we can't get to, you know where I work, and I can definitely get back to you afterwards. So we also have the flip chart here today to write down some questions that I may need to follow up on or find out the answer for you later. But the whole purpose of today is to get a training for city staff on the Stormwater BMP Guidance Manual. Does everyone know what BMP stands for? Best Management Practices. So that's a term we use loosely. And I also wanted to talk about a few other terms I hear thrown around by city staff, and it gets confusing as to what's what. A lot of people refer to our stormwater management program as the NPDES. I hear people say that a lot. Yeah, the NPDES. That's simply a fancy acronym from the federal government that stands for the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. It's just a name for a law that was passed that says that we have to implement a stormwater management program. So let me distinguish between the two. The city has had our stormwater management program, or SWIMP, for the past 3 years. We've been implementing it informally, but it has not been adopted or approved by the State Water Board until just recently, this January of 2009, it was finally approved. So now this is a formal document that the city is required by the state, and really the Federal Clean Water Act is the overarching law that implements this requirement. But the SWIMP is something that the city has to implement. And what the SWIMP calls for, one of the things in this stormwater management program, which is a city document, it says that we have to have a guidance manual that explains how to incorporate these laws and stormwater requirements into our city programs, and especially into local development. And so this is the Stormwater BMP Guidance Manual. Another term that was used loosely for this was TGM. Early on we were calling it the Technical Guidance Manual. Same thing. This is our guidance manual for stormwater management. I like to just keep it simple and call it our guidance manual. So it's important to distinguish between the two, because what the SWIMP does, and that's this big document, is it lays out what are the city requirements to protect surface water quality. What are the city requirements for stormwater management? And it goes through a series of best management practices that we are required by the state to implement. And just one of the things in here says, oh yeah, and have a guidance manual that tells people how to do it. That's what this is, the guidance manual. So what Brandon is going over with y'all today is exactly what's in this guidance manual in kind of a general overview way. We're trying to make it simple so people can understand. There's a lot of really technical calculations and designs in here that are meant for engineers and design professionals to use. So this is not just a tool for city staff. It's also a tool for the local architects and builders and contractors who are hired by city residents to develop and redevelop our city. So this is a reference for them, too, that we as city staff need to guide people to. But today, the focus is how we as city staff need to use the document. If Brandon's training formally is an engineer, so I've asked him to try to stay away from the engineering lingo and keep it more to, you know, basic language that every person in here can understand. And if you have questions, engineering technical questions, don't be afraid to bring them up after the workshop. We can challenge Brandon here. Or if he starts to use acronyms or words that just don't make sense to you, don't be afraid to raise your hand in the middle of the presentation. I want to clear up actual word confusions in the beginning. So if there's anything that he's using, like a term over and over again, that you're like, gosh, I just don't know what that means, don't hesitate to raise your hand and just ask about a term. But if you have a question, you know, of context or a substantial question, hold it until the end of the presentation so we can get through it all, and then we'll get to it. So the presentation shouldn't be more than about, what is it, about an hour and a quarter, hour and 20 minutes. We've got about 50 slides to go through, and I think it's interesting, so try not to fall asleep. Luckily, this one's in the morning. The last training presentation was in the afternoon from 3 to 5, and that's a tough one. But anyway, I think that's it. They should be running over the slide handouts here shortly, so just be patient. We might miss the first couple of slides. One other thing I wanted to mention is that this is being filmed today by City TV. So we are going to be able to have, that's my cell phone, excuse me. So we have this on video. If there is any city staff here that say, oh gosh, I missed that training, you know, where do I go to see it? Can I please, you know, view it and get the information from the training? Give me a call or email me, and I'll direct you to where it is. And afterwards, we will also record the questions, so we have a microphone that we can hand around to people and just make sure that we have the questions recorded and that those questions are actually answered or followed up on. So with that, here's Brandon Steets, and thanks a lot. Oh, yeah, thanks. I wanted to mention, we have the sign-in sheet here. I want to make sure that every single person who's here today signs in, because that's the only way you're going to get LEAP credit. So be sure to sign your name. And if your name isn't listed on this paper, if you aren't officially on the sign-in list, just sign your name clearly so I can read it at the bottom, and we'll make sure that you get the credit, because you get 2 hours today for this. I think that's it.
Howdy, folks. My name is Brandon Steets. I'm with Geosyntec Consultants. We are an engineering firm here in town, and we wrote the technical guidance manual that Autumn just held up. Quite a novel, but hopefully I can guide you through it today and its simplicity, and leave some of the details for the engineers to work out as they're coming forward with projects and their stormwater designs. Yeah, I'll speak up a little bit. Is this on? Yeah. Okay. Let's see if I can figure this thing out. Do you remember the... oh, am I going to use this? Sorry. Excuse me. All right, there we go. Excuse me. So the manual has 6 chapters. And I'm going to go through the chapters briefly first, and then we'll touch on the details of each in the order of the project types of projects that you'll get through your review process. The first chapter is an introduction, describes the purpose of the manual, the NIPDs, that's the state permit requirement that Autumn referred to earlier, that describes the municipal requirements for stormwater programs. Included in that is a stormwater management plan, and then included under that is a BMP manual. So the Chapter 1 introduction of the manual describes this regulatory context or setting, and then it describes how to use the manual and what we refer to as project tiers. And I'll go into that in a second, but essentially project tiers are these 3 tiers from small to medium to large size projects that come through the city's design review process, and certain requirements apply to each. So increasing requirements for the larger size or larger tier projects. Chapter 2 of the manual is a site assessment that engineers and project applicants need to go through to evaluate their site and then to select the appropriate best management practices. Chapter 3 is a site soil and infiltration assessment for the largest size projects. These are the assessments that the applicants need to do of their site to evaluate and select the most appropriate BMPs. And then there's a list of site design BMP options. I'm going to go into these in more detail, but the site design BMPs are essentially taking a step back, looking at your site, thinking about how you can lay out your site to minimize the amount of stormwater runoff that comes off it. The Chapter 5 basic BMPs are a list of very simple, anyone can do type of best management practices that are applicable for the smallest size projects. These are for like single family residential, small, new or redevelopment projects. And then Chapter 6 are what we refer to as stormwater runoff BMP options, which are the more complicated or larger, more difficult to design projects where generally you'll hire an engineer or a landscape architect to design. And then we have appendixes. So starting with the purpose of the manual. The manual's intended purpose is to reduce surface water pollution from urban stormwater runoff to the city's creeks. Noting that urban runoff, this is kind of our motivation for developing this and probably for the creation of the creeks program in general. Urban runoff is the #1 contributor to surface water pollution in Santa Barbara, and recently over 15 Santa Barbara water bodies were listed as impaired by the Regional Water Board last year. So water bodies include stretches of beach, stretches of creeks that are identified as this term that they use is impaired. Under the Clean Water Act, municipalities, or I should say regional boards and state boards, are required to identify water bodies that are not up to snuff. They don't meet the water quality standards that are applicable to them. So this has come into Santa Barbara's local context recently. So this is a real problem. Stormwater pollution is a real problem that we're trying to address through new development requirements, amongst other programs. Excuse me. So continuing with the purpose of the manual is to provide guidance to city staff and residents, as well as, like Autumn described, some of the practitioners in town, the engineers, landscape architects, who are the consultants of the project applicants, the developers. The requirements apply to post-construction runoff, and to define this term, construction runoff is something that is required to be controlled through erosion, sediment control practices by construction contractors through a stormwater pollution prevention plan. You guys probably heard of this, a SWIP. This manual only focuses on post-construction runoff. So after the construction is done, you have your new development completed. These best management practices are intended to address runoff from that new or redeveloped project into the future. So the requirements of the stormwater management program. Cities, again, we talked a little bit about this, but the city is required to implement a stormwater management program under the Federal Clean Water Act. It was recently approved in January of 2009, and it's on a 5-year cycle. So they all have to reopen and revise that SWIP 5 years from now. This is year 1 of that program. In the stormwater management plan, there are various requirements that occur over different years. So the city's committed themselves to, during year 1, maybe develop a BMP manual, provide training on BMPs like we're doing here today, and various other requirements. So that the schedule, where we're at in the schedule of the stormwater management plan is very relevant. The stormwater management plan must include 6 sections. So this is, again, just to give you a brief overview of what the stormwater management program consists of. It consists, every municipality in the country of this size needs to have these 6 elements in their stormwater management plan. Public education, public participation, illicit discharge detection elimination. So that's looking at for cross connects between your sanitary sewer and your storm sewer. I'm sure a lot of people know this, but in Santa Barbara, we're not like the older cities, East Coast cities that have combined sewer systems. Here we have separate sewer systems. So what enters or what runs off the roadway from rooftops goes into the streets, curbs and gutters, into a separate storm sewer that makes it out to the creeks or to the ocean, whereas the sanitary sewer line takes black water and gray water from residences, commercial properties, flush the toilets, the sinks, and that goes into a sewer system that is treated by a wastewater treatment plant and then discharged through an ocean outfall or recycled here in town for non-potable irrigation. So that illicit discharge is looking for cross connects. There shouldn't be cross connects between those two systems. Construction site stormwater runoff control. So that's what I described earlier through the SWIP, the Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan process. Construction sites are intended to control their own runoff. The fifth element is post-construction runoff control, and that is the intended focus of this BMP manual and today's training. Lastly, there's pollution prevention, good housekeeping practices for the municipal programs. And post-construction runoff control requirements vary by project type, and that's where I'm going to describe this tiered system. And taking a step back, we don't expect you, I don't think the Creeks Division expects you to remember everything here. I don't think they expect you to take detailed notes. It's more to just listen, try to get a sense for the purpose and function of this manual, this resource that the Creeks Division has, and understand how it's going to be implemented. When project applicants come to you and they say, is there a resource to help me select best management practices for my project? How do I know if my project's required to do these things? How big should I size them? You have now the background to say, this is the resource you should be looking at. There's information in there that can help you select, size your systems. Yes, you're required to do that because of such and such information in the manual. So that's kind of the purpose of this. Now, fundamentally, the manual funnels different size projects into these various tiers. The first tier are the smallest projects that have less than 500 square feet of new or replaced impervious area. So impervious area, what is that? That's hardscape around a commercial or residential property. It includes sidewalks, parking lot, driveway, rooftop, areas where rainwater falls on and doesn't infiltrate or percolate into the soil. New, that's pretty clear, new impervious area. They're constructing new impervious area over what was previously natural, vegetated, or soil area. Replace impervious area, that means that you have impervious area that was redone or redeveloped or replaced. Tier 2, these are the medium projects, and I'm going to describe in a second the requirements associated with each, but they're in increasing complexity for each of these tiers. Medium projects are residential projects with between 500 and 4,000 square feet of new or replaced imperviousness. Lastly, large projects, Tier 3. These are residential projects with more than 4,000 square feet of new or replaced imperviousness, or commercial, mixed use, parking lots with more than 10 spaces, more than or equal to 10 spaces, hillside residential, and public works projects. Now, what are the requirements for each? Tier 1. Tier 1 is just complete voluntary implementation. These are the small projects that I described. Somebody's redeveloping or they're adding an addition on their house. It's less than 500 square feet of imperviousness. It's voluntary. And I'm going to describe some of the measures because you're going to say, well, what's voluntary? What are the actions? I'll describe some simple BMPs that they can do that anyone should be able to implement around their property. Tier 2 requirements are a basic BMP. Those are the simple BMPs that I was describing. And then anything beyond that is voluntary. This is an example of a Tier 2 project. So they come through, and this is obviously a very simplistic site plan, but this is intended to show you this is the level of simplicity that we're talking about. Project applicants come in, they say, all right, I've got 1,000 square feet of imperviousness. I'm of replaced imperviousness. I want to re-roof my house, something like that, or expand my driveway and add an addition to my house. They can even draw this on a sketch. This was a hand sketch. This is obviously like a PowerPoint. This is complex for what can be handed in. So they can sketch this out and show you that I'm a Tier 2 project because of the area that's new or replaced, and this is my layout, my site plan. These are some downspouts that I have. Downspouts are, where on the edge of your roof where the gutters collect stormwater runoff, route it down vertically, and then under conventional means is directed to either the sidewalk, the road, or a driveway. What we've recommended here is that they be routed to, on this site plan, a rain barrel. And I'll describe what that is, but basically a barrel that is more aesthetic than a simple 55-gallon drum, but functions that way to collect stormwater runoff from the roof and can be used to irrigate adjacent landscaping. What I show on the bottom is a disconnected downspout. So the runoff can be routed instead of towards the driveway like it might have otherwise been done, but spread over some adjacent landscaping. And then for this particular site plan example, they could have permeable pavement. So I'll go into some examples of those, but they include permeable asphalt or paver blocks.
I think it's important to note that this shows 3 potential basic BMPs, and for the Tier 2 projects, they only have to choose 1 or more. So this, any Tier 2 project, medium-sized project, only have to implement 1 basic BMP. This is just showing 3 examples.
So if you have a project applicant, they demonstrate that they're a Tier 2 project. They come in with a sketch or a drawing of their site layout, and they just simply show what basic BMP they're going to implement. And I'll talk about more examples later on. I think, Autumn, at this point we wanted to go through okay. So if you open to the second page of your handout booklet, it should look like this. It's a table. I think it's called Table 1.1. Yeah, Table 1.1. This describes the 3 tiers that I just described to you. And then they have different chapters in the manual. So it describes which chapter of the manual. So if a project applicant comes in, they say, all right, I've got X square feet of imperviousness. You tell them, look in the BMP manual, and they can find right in the front, Table 1.1, this simple table which tells them which chapters of the manual are applicable to their size project. And you can see, as I described earlier, everything's voluntary. The triangle is voluntary for Tier 1 projects. Only the basic BMPs are applicable to the Tier 2 projects, and then all of the entire manual is essentially applicable to these larger Tier 3 projects. If you turn your page, you should have a, yeah. That's correct.
Yeah, that's a good distinction to make. Tiers 1 and 2 are only applied to residential projects. Tier 3 is what applies to the commercial and residential bigger than 4,000 square feet. Mixed use.
And industrial?
Industrial. Tier 3 is kind of the catch-all of whatever's not in Tier 1 or Tier 2.
So if we turn the page to the flow chart now, it's a multicolored flow chart. This is a graphic that was created by City Creek staff to help articulate this process a little bit better. Essentially, you look at the top left bubble, you say, is your project one of these? If yes, your next question is, does it require planning commission review? If yes, you've got these 3, what we refer to as sizing requirements. So these are the Tier 3 projects I described earlier that have these kind of more complex best management practice requirements. Now, for those best management practices, they're required to size their systems or facilities based on these 3 requirements. And I'll describe those 3 requirements more later. But if you don't require planning commission review, then they only have 1 sizing requirement. So it's a subtle distinction here. If your project is not any of these categories in tier 3, then you look, is it tier 1 or is it tier 2? And for the tier 2 projects, again, you go into this category of, does it require planning commission review?
So that's a distinction that's important to make, that this flowchart is showing, that it's not just the tier 1, 2, 3 size that makes the call on what the requirements are. It's also whether or not the project goes to planning commission. That's kind of the big thing. So a planning commission review on a project will trigger these SWIMP requirements. And if planning commission is not required for a tier 3 project that size, then there's only one SWIMP requirement that they have to implement, and that's to capture and treat the 1-inch storm. Most of you guys have heard me say that a lot. But he'll get into those requirements later.
So basically, when a project applicant comes in, they've got two questions. What type and size is their project? That tells you what tier it is. And then, does it require planning commission review?
Some of the discretionary applications for mixed-use projects in commercial go to the staff planning officer instead of BPC.
That's a good question for at the end of the presentation. I think subtle distinctions like that are stuff that we need to work through, yeah.
Yeah, maybe table that. That's a good one. Another thing that I want to touch on before we move out of this question of what applies, what doesn't. The next page in your handouts is Appendix J. And this is a living list or a working list of discretionary projects that are exempt from Tier 3 requirements. So if an applicant comes in and they say, well, yeah, but I'm just doing this, or you can see some examples here. I have a second-story addition. That's the first bullet. Third bullet is I have an interior remodel. Is that applicable? So you can see here that they can look to here and say, oh, I'm an interior remodel. It's exempt from these requirements. So there are these additional list of exemptions that you should be aware of, that this list exists. And we're working with different, at least Creek's department is working with different departments in the city to build upon this list if it's necessary and applicable. So this is being viewed as a working document. And this is Appendix J that's found in the Best Management Practice Manual. All right, moving on through our presentation. Now talking about some Tier 3 projects. So we went through a simple site plan for a Tier 2 project. And you see for Tier 3 projects, the Stormwater Management Program sizing requirements apply. I'm going to go into those in more detail later, but essentially that is the requirements that describe how large your best management practices need to be based on how much impervious area you've added or replaced. Because it's not very meaningful if somebody comes in and they make a tiny little rain barrel and you've replaced your entire roof, right? It needs to be big enough to address the amount of runoff coming off the property. For Tier 3 projects, the city's DART review checklist applies. This is a checklist that I'm sure you all are very familiar with and has been in place for before the manual has been in. And if we turn in your handouts, you can see the Stormwater Management Program Requirements Summary. This is just a resource for you to have handy when you leave here, something that you're probably already intimately familiar with, followed by the DART SWIMP checklist. And something to note here is that after each major element of the DART SWIMP checklist, you can see which department is responsible for each of these. So if you're asking yourself now, well, does this apply to me? When does my review come into play? What elements of the design review related to stormwater am I required to check off? You can see in here in the DART SWIMP checklist, building and safety. They're intended to address erosion and sediment controls. Public works, intended to address peak stormwater runoff discharge rates. Again, this is nothing new. I'm not trying to describe new information here. This DART checklist predates the BMP manual. I don't think we have page numbers on here, but if it should be early in there, maybe around the 5th page. Around page 9, I'm told. Okay. Didn't even see you there, Cameron. All right. So I want to give, just like I gave a quick example on a Tier 2 type of project, I want to give a quick example on a Tier 3 type of project. And I believe this is in your handout as well. So if you want to pass the Dart Swim checklist. Autumn's holding up the page in your handout. So this is an actual example that came through the city of a Tier 3 type of project. It's I would recommend you look at your booklet rather than this slide, just because the size of the slide. But I'm going to describe to you what's happening here and why this is a good example of a Tier 3 type of project that met the requirements of the Best Management Practice Manual. What you have here is you have your house. You know, this is your full parcel. This is your house. This is a detached garage and a pool. You've got your standard driveway, some front yard, and a side yard. What they have here is they've identified various downspouts. Again, that's where your runoff is collected from your roof. In the front yard, that's routed towards the front yard, the landscaped area, which they refer to as a grass filter here, which is simply, grass filter is one of the simplest BMPs you can have, where it's simply a grassed or vegetated area that's flat, a slight slope away from the building, and the runoff is spread across it, and it's allowed to be filtered through the grass and infiltrate into the soils. On the side yard, they also collect the roof gutter flows, and it goes towards the west here in a grass swale, which is another simple. These things are all iterations of one another, really. The grass filter is just a flat area. The grass swale is simply a trapezoidal area that conveys runoff, kind of like a concrete ditch does, but it's earthen lined and it's vegetated. Again, the concept is just trying to slow down flows, filter flows, get it into the ground rather than shooting it immediately to the creeks and to the streets and gutters. Another element of this plan is that they have, for this entire driveway area, it's permeable pavement. So the rainwater that falls on this and any downspouts that are directed towards it will infiltrate. It's serving as a sponge. It'll percolate down into the soils. So this is an excellent example of a Tier 3 project that meets all the BMP requirements of the manual. All right. Now what I'm going to go through are some site design BMP examples. So earlier, if you recall, I described a couple different categories of best management practices that the manual describes. One of them is site design BMPs. Another are the simple BMPs that are really most applicable to single-family type of smaller projects. And then the stormwater runoff BMPs, which are kind of the more complex ones, generally designed, most often designed by a contractor or consultant. So this first one is the site design BMP options, which are essentially looking at your site, the opportunities and constraints that you have, what kind of soils you have, where you're intended to develop and how it's configured relative to the slope of your property, to look at ways before you plan to build or design anything that you can try to maximize the storage of water on your own site before discharging it into the roadways. And there's 6 types of site design BMP options that I'm going to go through here. The first is conserving and restoring natural areas. Now, like a lot of the presentation, I'm not going to go through some of the details. You have the slides that you'll be able to take with you. You can use this document as a reference, just like you can use the handouts as a reference. But just focusing on the pictures for now, understanding that this obviously isn't a graphic of a Santa Barbara neighborhood, but the concept applies, where the one approach to a subdivision is to preserve some of the area, and another approach is to maximize the the parcel footprint and spread the houses. So with the left layout, where it's the subdivision is tighter, you can see there's more area preserved, and in total, from this area, you're going to have less runoff. So less water quality and water quantity impact to the adjacent streams and ocean. So conserving and restoring the natural areas on a property. That's one of the first site design layouts. Second type of site design BMP is locating your best management practices on infiltrative soils. You look at your property, you look at if soils vary across the site. This may apply to some bigger sites that have a lot of variety there. And you look where it's most infiltrative, and that's where you want to site some of your infiltration systems. Minimizing soil disturbance and compaction. So before you build your house pad, you want to, in general, they compact the soil. Limiting the area that you compact the soil will maximize the infiltration in the landscaped areas. So compacted soils, they can reduce the infiltration capability of soils by tenfold. So by minimizing the soil disturbance and compaction on your property to only the areas that you're going to build on top of, that's a great first step. Third, minimizing impervious surface. So to the extent possible within your site plan, to minimize how much area in terms of driveway or rooftop that is going to cause runoff, create stormwater runoff. Here's an example of a single-story building. It's obviously a very simple concept, but where you make it a 3-story building, and you've obviously reduced your footprint by two-thirds. Another example of site design type of BMP is to disconnect impervious surfaces and use the pervious areas of your site. So conventionally, how sites are designed, how properties are designed, are to have the roofs drain directly to their gutters, downspouts, to the driveway, to the curb, to the sidewalk, to the street, by what we call this term disconnecting the impervious areas. So by having that rooftop instead go to your vegetated area, that's one means of reducing the runoff from your property as a whole. So by disconnecting, same thing with the driveway. If you can have a trench or a speed bump type of design, the lower portion of your driveways before sheet flow comes off your driveway into the street, and then instead routing it to the adjacent vegetated area or landscaped area, another great way to get the runoff or prevent runoff, minimize runoff to the city's storm sewer system. Here's an example of good site design. You've got a layout of a property. Maybe they're using porous pavement. Maybe they've narrowed their driveway to maximize their backyard and minimize the length of their driveway. They might have a swale running parallel to the street. Some rain barrels that collect runoff from the downspout and are used for irrigation during drier conditions. Some rain gardens, I'll describe what that is, but a simple landscaped area that can receive and infiltrate stormwater runoff. They've conserved natural areas. Here's an area with some trees. So this is an example of very good site design. Now we understand that there may be some elements of this site design that may be in conflict with existing zoning or transportation requirements and other municipal codes and ordinances. And Geosyntec is working with the Creeks Division right now and various other departments with the city to at least start to develop a master list of where those conflicts may exist so we can understand them better and try to develop solutions down the road. So we are aware that certain elements of this program may, I'm sure some of you guys are already thinking, well, I'm in public works. We have this municipal code or ordinance that may be in conflict with the street widths elements of this or the frontage elements. So those are being worked through. So I just described 6 site design BMP options that project applicants can go through. And again, that was applicable to Tier 3 projects. Now, here are some basic BMP options. These are the simple best management practice options that I described earlier as, basically any homeowner can do, and these apply to the lower tiered sites. So there's no sizing requirement for these. This is simply do what you can do and what you're willing to do. It's easier to implement than some of the more complex systems that I'm going to describe next that are in Chapter 6 of the manual. And for this, we do recommend simple site assessment and soil testing for the Tier 2 projects. Remember, Tier 1 was less than 500 square feet of new or replaced imperviousness. So these are some very simple basic BMP options that I've started to discuss before, but now you have some pictures to go with those descriptions. Disconnected downspouts, term that you heard me use before. Again, you've got your downspout here. Instead of directing it right to the driveway or to the curb, this is being directed to the adjacent landscaping. Flow spreading. Again, it looks like we have some runoff from the side of the house or from the roof, and it's being spread through some rock across the landscaped area. So rather than it coming out as one concentrated flow that might run across the property, this is being spread so it'll maximize how much makes its way into the ground. Rain gardens. So this is a concept that may be a little overwhelming at first, but is surprisingly simple, really. It's a small excavated area, so you can be hand dug, so small. You can see relative to the side of a house what we're talking about here. That's backfilled with some soil or mulch and planted. Recommend some native vegetation that requires minimal irrigation. Captures runoff from rooftop area, and as this concept gets larger, it can turn into a more complex design, which I can describe to you later. But basically what we're talking about, a small area that here's a cross section of is lower than the surrounding area and can receive runoff and acts as a bit of a sponge, and can be quite aesthetic. It can be worked into your landscaping for your property. Rain barrels. So this is a very simple solution, again, where you purchase this at your local Home Depot, and it's generally a 55-gallon or drum. Can be aesthetic and can have a nicer look. Can be painted or designed more ornamental to fit into your motif for your home. And it's a very simple design where the downspout connects to the top, fills up during a rain event. After a rain event, you use that water. There's a nozzle with a hose on the bottom, and it can be gravity. There's no pumps or anything like that. It's just gravity spread, and you use it for irrigation through your adjacent landscaping. So there's a water conservation or water supply benefit to some of these systems as well. You're saving water that you would have paid for otherwise to irrigate the property. During a drought, this is a great solution. Understanding, of course, this water will only last a few weeks after the rain event, but it's one way to save water use at your site. Contained planters. This is pretty simple, and the concept is quite simple as well. By having contained planters on impervious area, you're reducing your impervious area footprint. Pretty straightforward. Some other designs, we refer to this as depression storage, but this is nothing more than a lower area on your property, in this case here, I believe it's Chase Palm Park, where stormwater runoff can be routed towards and it can percolate. Ribbon driveways, so by reducing the impervious area or the hardscaping of your driveway. Permeable pavement, can be paver blocks or actual permeable asphalt that has porosity to it, that has pore spaces so that rainwater can vertically percolate through into the ground. So this is a nice alternative to standard pavement. Some more basic BMP options. soil amendments. You amend your yard with mulch, and it's got more capacity now than it had before, which may have had native soils or compacted soils, and now it's more spongy. Can hold more rainwater, can hold more runoff from your adjacent hardscape. Native landscaping. They require less irrigation, and with less irrigation, you have less dry weather runoff. So during dry weather, sometimes people turn on their automated timers, and some of that irrigation unintentionally will run off to the streets. All right, so now we're moving on to Chapter 6. So what I just described, taking a step back, were the site design BMPs. Those are ways to lay out your site to reduce the amount of runoff. Basic BMPs, which are kind of the simplest things that homeowners can do to reduce runoff through small systems from their property. Now, these are for the Tier 3 projects, and these are the systems that we have some of the more complicated design calculations described in the back part of the manual for project applicants to review. And these have sizing requirements. So these are the best management practices. I'll give some examples, and I'll describe these sizing requirements. But these have requirements that tell you how big you need to build them based on how much hardscape is running off towards it. So going forward with Chapter 6, there are some design specifications. I'm going to go through an example of some of the tables that the project applicants will use. Again, you don't need to understand these in their gory detail, but it's good for you to know how BMP designers need to use this resource when they're selecting and sizing their systems on their site. The manual also has in Chapter 6 some information on operations and maintenance, since that's going to be a key element to any of these systems. You want to select systems that have minimal operation and maintenance requirements. And most of these, or all of these, are gravity-driven systems. There's no pumps required. So we just really want to maintain, we want to have minimal operation and maintenance requirements for these systems. All right, so this is the stormwater runoff BMP selection procedure. You start by identifying your site and soil conditions, and your primary pollutants of concern is a word that's missing here. I want to go to your handout, and let's see, what's the next page that you have there? All right. You should have site assessment and BMP selection. Do you see that? Is that a chapter that you have there? All right. This is a chapter in the manual, Chapter 2. So I'm kind of going back. I went through Chapters 3, 4, 5, 6. Now I'm going to go to Chapter 2, Site Assessment and BMP Selection. This is a chapter that has information for project applicants to use to help select which BMPs are most applicable for their site, most appropriate for their site. On the table on the bottom, which spans 2 pages, you'll see there's some various information about a property that is relevant to this question, which BMP is most appropriate for my site. You can see you're looking at your soils, you're looking at your topography, and other information that's relevant. I'm going to just kind of cursorily skim over some of this information that's contained here. Table 2.2, if you turn the page, this is a table that summarizes what we call pollutants of concern. So these are different categories of pollutants or chemicals that are found in stormwater runoff that are associated with different kinds of land uses. So this table is very simple, and it says for which kind of land use, which pollutant categories are most appropriate. So then if I'm a project applicant and I want to build an industrial site or restore an industrial site, I'm going to look at this and say, all right, all of them except for metals, it shows here, are applicable to my site. For commercial property, again, all of them except for metals are applicable to my site. So you look at your land use, and it tells you which pollutants you need to be concerned about. Why this is relevant is because your pollutants of concern help you select your BMP. BMPs have different effectiveness or treatment capability for different pollutant categories. So I'm going to continue turning the pages here to skim through this chapter. Table 2.3 is the next table that you encounter. again, it describes these pollutant categories. And in this case, certain pollutant categories are more important depending on what watershed you're in. Now, there are different creeks in the city. A lot of you guys, know about these. You know about Mission Creek. You've heard about Arroyo Burro Creek, Goleta Slough, which is in the city of Santa Barbara as well, and different ocean areas or beach areas that are at the mouths of different creeks. These areas or water bodies are identified as impaired or sensitive to these different pollutant categories. So a project applicant comes in, they say, my site is in the Mission Creek watershed, and watershed is simply a term that describes all of the area that drains to a creek. And they say, I'm in Mission Creek watershed, which pollutants do I need to, in particular, address? You look at this and you say Mission Creek, bacteria, and toxicity. These are the two constituents that are of most relevance to me. And now I'm going to move forward, and you can see how this information is going to be used. Now you're going to see some figures, some graphics, maps. These are some additional references that are found in here that are more information that you can use to assess the conditions at your site. So you can look on here, it's a map of the city, and you can see what soil groups span the city. In the legend on the bottom left, you've got your hydrologic soil groups A, B, C, and D. Basically, what you need to know about this is that A and B are the two more infiltrative soils. So they're very appropriate for siting infiltrative type of BMPs on them. C and D are tighter soils, have more clay content, less infiltrative capability. So this is relevant to a project applicant who comes in and says, well, are my soil types appropriate for using infiltrative BMPs? Yet I'm just going to keep skimming some of the information that's contained in the manual that are resources for project applicants to use when they're selecting certain BMPs for their site. The next page are the hillside design districts. Many of you folks are probably much more familiar with this than any of us. Continuing to skim here, there's a map of the steep sloped areas with the yellow and orange areas being the steeper areas. This is relevant because you don't want to site infiltrative BMPs on steep slope areas. Continuing to move forward, some of the resources that are here, there's an overlay map of the hillside design districts over the steep slope areas. And then finally, Table 6.1. There's two tables here, Table 6.1 and 6.2. These are the kind of the finishing products. So you take all the information that you used previously to assess your site. You looked at your soil types. You looked at how the site drained. And now you look at this and you looked at your pollutants that you need to address. And this is a table that has the BMP categories on the left side, the left row, and then across the top, you've got your pollutant categories. So this is where your project applicant comes in and they say, all right, I saw I was in Mission Creek. Metals were relevant. I saw I'm a residential property. Metals are something I need to be concerned about. I want to look here at metals. You can see it's across the top. It's a third from the right. And I want to find a very effective BMP for metals. You look at the key on the bottom. Very high and high. Those are the ones you want to focus on. I see that bioretention, which is the very top row of BMP types, is listed as high for metals. It's as simple as that. They look here and they say, all right, well, I want bioretention. I'll describe more about what bioretention consists of. That's appropriate for and effective for addressing metals. Moving on to the next table, Table 6.2. It's a second BMP selection matrix. This is where, so the first one was to say which BMPs are most appropriate for which pollutant categories. This one is now which BMPs are most appropriate for which site constraints. So you look at this and you look across the top. Again, you got your BMPs on the left columns and then your site considerations across the top row. The size of your drainage area or your project, the size or the slope that you're your site is built on, the depth to groundwater, your soil category, your distance from nearby drinking wells, whether you're in coastal bluff areas, whether you're in hillside design districts. You can see that all this information is summarized in a matrix that helps project applicants understand which BMPs are most appropriate. So let's go through one example, bioretention. I was thinking about doing bioretention. I knew metals were applicable to my site. I looked at table 6.1. Bioretention was effective for metals. Let me take a look at bioretention across the top row of BMPs, and it looks like, well, depth to seasonally high groundwater. Am I in an area, a low-lying area of the city, where I need to worry about depth to groundwater? In some of the lowest portions of the city that were formerly marsh, you've got really shallow groundwater depths. This says less than 2 feet with underdrains, more than 10 feet without underdrains. If I'm in one of those low-lying areas of the city, now I know I need to design my system with underdrains. And I'm going to show an example of what that looks like in a second. So I think that takes us through the handouts and the Chapter 6 assessments. I should say Chapter 2 site assessments. I know there's a lot of information there. Again, you're not intended to memorize any of this. You're not intended to be able to leave this meeting and be able to design BMPs yourself. This is just a cursory review of the information that's contained in the manual. Applicant's going to come to you and say, what do I do? Do you have any resources to help me select my BMPs? And you can say, it's in the manual. So I just described several of these processes, and I'm going to move on to the onerous BMP sizing requirements. So these are for the Tier 3 projects. In the case of those that require planning review, all three sizing requirements apply. Planning Commission review. Where Planning Commission review doesn't apply, only one of these sizing requirements apply. There are three sizing requirements. The first is peak runoff discharge rate. So this is a requirement is a flood control type of requirement. It's intended to reduce the maximum rate that stormwater runoff will leave the property because you've got constrictions downstream in the stormwater system that only allow so much flow to pass in a certain time. So this is important for flooding purposes. Again, this applies to Tier 3 projects that require Planning Commission review. And I'm not going to go through the details of this, but it's suffice to say that there is a requirement for controlling the amount of runoff from the new or replaced hardscaping from your site. The second sizing requirement is called a volume reduction requirement. And this has multiple benefits, but it's intended to control the volume or the amount rather than the rate of runoff from your site. And by doing that, you're going to have a water supply benefit to the city. You're going to have more water in the groundwater, replenishing your aquifers, rather than in the creeks making its way to the ocean as runoff that has contamination in it. And I should clarify because a question may come up. Well, do I want runoff to make its way into the groundwater? And groundwater is a drinking water resource locally. Well, soil it's been used for millennium to treat all kinds of waters, wastewater included, and it's one of the most effective means at filtering and treating, removing pollutants from water. And stormwater runoff will not cause an issue for contaminating local water supplies unless there's a significant industrial type of contamination associated with that runoff. So this is a volume reduction requirements. Again, only applies for Tier 3 projects that require Planning Commission review. The final third sizing requirement for how big you need to build these systems is a water quality treatment requirement. This applies to all Tier 2 or Tier 3 discretionary projects. And there's two different ways to do it. You can either select it based on how much water or how fast water comes off your site. So again, the water quality is the only sizing requirement that applies to all the projects, those that go through Planning Commission, those that don't. Otherwise, if your project goes through Planning Commission review, all three of these sizing requirements apply. And 1, 2, and 3, yeah. And if you have questions about this, we can take those at the end. I know it's kind of complicated. Strategies for meeting the requirements. So the volume reduction and water quality, because this may come up, your project applicant says, how am I ever going to do this? How can I size my BMPs based on these 3 requirements? I've got 3 different requirements. It's kind of onerous. These are not additive. These can be done together. So by using site design and stormwater runoff BMPs on your property, you're addressing your runoff rate, you're addressing your runoff amount or volume, and you're addressing water quality issues. So they're not additive, they're just applicable to different protective issues, flood control or water quality. So again, it can be done through a combination of basic BMPs, site design BMPs. In some cases, treatment trains are a good example to use. I'll show you what that is. So a treatment train is simply putting a couple systems together in a row or in series. So here's an example. You've got roadway runoff, in this case, doesn't have a curb, and roof runoff. Here's a grass filter strip. Again, that's what I described earlier. It's the simplest thing. These are lawns, right? So it runs through the grass filter strip. Then there's an area, a depressed area, where flow is concentrated or collected and is routed along what we call a grass swale towards a bioretention cell. I'm going to describe that, but it's like a planter. It's like the rain gardens that I described earlier, where you've got an area that you dug out, backfilled with some amended soil, some mulch in there. It's very spongy, a lot of porosity and ability to hold water, and then only then does it make its way into the storm drain system. So by putting several BMPs in series, you're maximizing how much water that you prevent from making its way into the creeks and ocean. All right, you've heard some talk about bioretention, and it's probably worth going to an example of what bioretention is, because it's one of the most effective BMPs. If project applicants come to you and they say, I've looked at the manual, I'm thinking about bioretention, I need to learn more information about it, you can tell them that there's design elements or design pages in the manual that guide them through the design of a bioretention system, but know that this is one of the most effective BMPs that can be built. So it's a landscape shallow depression that captures, temporarily stores, filters, and infiltrates stormwater runoff. It's like a bigger version of a rain garden. Can be used for all kinds of different projects. This is essentially what it consists of. I've got 3 examples here. So they all involve topsoil, some vegetation, and an amended soil layer. This is 2 to 3 feet of amended soil. You've got runoff from the adjacent areas, again coming from driveways, rooftops, any impervious area, and it's routed towards this sunken area, vegetated area, and it's intended to store water or allow water to pond up and then percolate vertically into the groundwater. Now if you have, because if you recall in that one example I gave, what if your site is located with really high groundwater and you don't have enough soil layer protecting the groundwater from the stormwater runoff? It's really shallow, your groundwater depths, and so you need to have under drains. So here's an example of where you've got a drain pipe, gravel layer, and a perforated PVC pipe that can drain the water. A lot of people have this in their backyards already. They have their landscaping, their irrigation set up. They've got under drains that currently probably route it to the curb. And that's where this goes. So the drain pipe that collects the infiltrated, filtered, treated water, it routes it towards the storm drain system. Just another example where there's a gravel layer beneath it. This is you have this in probably the last page of your handouts. This is an example, typical design drawing of bioretention. You see it in plan view or view from above, and you see it in cross-section view or view from the side. Same thing I described earlier, where you've got this rain garden type area and then a cross-section of your amended soil and which serves as filter media. So there's information in the manual that's applied to sizing the facilities and selecting plants. We even have a appendix in the manual, because if project applicants come to you and say, well, what plants do I cite or select for use on these BMPs? There is an appendix in the manual that was developed by a local landscape architect that lists native plants that are appropriate for different BMPs. So you want upland type of plants, plants that aren't used to being ponded on or near in the areas where you don't have water ponding occurring. You might want riparian or creek bank, creek edge type of plants in the areas that are going to be inundated with water from time to time. So there's a plant selection guidance appendix in the manual. Some information on operations and maintenance. So I'm just taking you through bioretention as an example for some of the information that's contained in the manual. There's information like this for all of the BMPs that are described in the manual. For O&M, operation and maintenance, for bioretention, things that they need to be concerned about long term is plant removal. If the plants get root rot or they die during a drought period, you may have to water during the plant's initial propagation or their initial growth establishment period. All stuff that landscape architects can address very easily. If there's erosion happening, if you designed it too steep, you need to revegetate the area that has been scoured. Mulch replacement, if you had mulch, now it's starting to clog, get silt up. Now you can scrape that initial couple of inches off and replace your mulch. And if you had topsoil, replacing your topsoil. So these are the type of operations and maintenance requirements that apply to these systems. So we're not talking about replacing your pumps or anything like that. These are gravity-driven systems. They're very simple. They're all, again, iterations of one another. They all essentially try to get runoff from hardscape to greenscape. Some examples of ways that these BMPs can fail. If you sited it on a very tight soil and they clog, or if they clog because you had, say, a construction site nearby or your own construction site, you built these and during construction, and you have silt from your construction area that's routed right to the top and it silts it up. And then if they're not maintained properly, if you don't replace the top soil layer every couple of years, if you don't replace the mulch area and they get silted up and then they overflow or pond up, they're not maintained properly. Another example, a vegetated swale. This is what I described earlier. Here's an example where it's roadside and the water is routed through a vegetated area that's sunken. A filter strip. This was basically a lawn. I described this earlier. Again, a cross-section that shows it as being adjacent to a parking lot or roadside area, and it's just a flat area that's vegetated that allows runoff to flow as we call it sheet flow across the top. Sand filter. Here's an example near UCSB dorms where with underdrains beneath it, you have a sand layer. Again, this is one of the more effective BMPs like bioretention. Runoff is routed towards it, and it percolates through the sand, so it's filtered, treated, and then it makes its way into underdrains, which are then routed to the storm drain system. All right, some infiltration BMPs. So BMPs that are specifically designed to take runoff, pond it up, and then get it into the ground. There are infiltration basins, so a simple basin or sunken area that ponds water and allows it to percolate downward. Here's an example of infiltration trench, which is just a dug trench, or excavated trench, that's backfilled with some pea gravel, has, in some cases, a flow spreader pipe, and this is a geofabric that's porous or permeable and allows water to go through it. And this is simply having runoff spread in this horizontal trench and allowed to pond up and then get into the ground. A more complex system that's probably going to be designed adjacent to or under a parking lot, and this is an underground reservoir that allows, again, water to pond up, and then it's on the bottom, it's open to the soils, and it's allowed to just percolate. cisterns or rain barrels. So a cistern is a big rain barrel, basically. Here's an example of a very large system adjacent to an office or commercial building that stores runoff from the rooftop and can be used later for irrigation purposes. Another example of a system is we call it a planter box, very similar to, identical basically to bioretention. What we have here are downspouts that are routed into this planter box. The planter box is adjacent to the building, but there is a barrier, an impermeable barrier that doesn't allow water to pass through that could potentially damage your structure. So this is just a box that is vegetated, has some mulch, and allows water to be taken from your rooftop and stored and then infiltrated in some soil. Green roof. It's a design that's not too common in the Southwest, but is starting to grow in popularity, and you see more in Portland. It's very popular in Chicago. And this is simply turning your rooftop, which was hardscape, into green space. So by planting vegetation, native vegetation on the roof, doesn't require irrigation except during the initial establishment period. You have some impermeable layers because you obviously don't want to get rot of the material of your roof, and it'll allow runoff once the water gets through the plant and topsoil layer back to the standard gutter and downspout system. Now, some other examples of bigger systems. I'm going to describe constructed wetlands or a wet and dry pond. These are some systems that are larger, generally take runoff from bigger areas. For the types of smaller projects that tend to come through Santa Barbara, these are probably less applicable, but when you do have large projects, this is an example design that's very useful. A constructed wetlands is a man-made or artificial wetlands. Wetlands, like bioretention, are one of the most effective means of cleansing runoff. Here's an example near the Manzanita dorms. And if a project applicant has a large-sized project, they want to go with a constructed wetlands, has a lot of multiple benefits, has education value. I think there's a walking path around this wetlands that describes some of the native species that may come visit the area, or describes the function of this to students. So there's education value, there's habitat value. Wet ponds, this is just like a wetlands, only it doesn't have multiple depth areas and the variety of vegetation. It's simply a basin or a pond area that's permanently wet, so it does require a permanent source of water. This is more common or popular around golf courses that need ponding for aesthetic purposes, and they can use that for kind of dual function, one aesthetic and then two for stormwater treatment. Dry detention basins. This is behind Costco, I think, and this is a simple design that has been used for a long time by flood control folks to reduce the rate that runoff comes from your property. So it's a simple basin area, depressed area, adjacent to your impervious area that takes the runoff, ponds it, slows it down, allows some of it to infiltrate or evaporate, and then slowly releases it. So it reduces the flooding risk downstream. Conclusions. So I'm wrapping it up now. We've taken you through all the chapters of the manual, taking you through some examples of some tier 1, 2, and 3 projects. And in conclusion, the stormwater management program, that the document that was held up earlier by Autumn, that is a document that was just approved in January, that's required by the Clean Water Act. It's a document not just for the Creeks Division staff, but it has department-wide responsibility, an element of which is the BMP manual, which applies to post-construction, new and redevelopment. And the last point that we wanted to make was that these water quality challenges that we have, so these are real problems, right? We have impairments to creeks and to beaches in terms of their water quality. I'm sure we've all seen it. You have foamy areas after a runoff event. You hear all the time about beach closures. These are real problems, but they've developed incrementally over centuries. Over the time it took to get from open space in Santa Barbara to where we're at now with near full build out, depending on how you look at it, with a lot of urbanization. And all of that urbanization comes with pollutants in trace amounts that makes its way into the creeks and ocean. So to solve such a kind of gargantuan problem, it can't be done in one fell swoop with one treatment system, kind of like you have for wastewater treatment. Fortunately, they have a collector system, and the economics work out where they can have one consolidated treatment system. For this, we need an incremental solution to an incremental problem. And that incremental solution, in this case, is being found in adding requirements for projects that come along. So we're kind of grandfathering in the previous systems, but as they redevelop, as open parcels are developed, we apply these requirements so that over time, incrementally, we get the bang for the buck that we were looking for. We get water quality, real water quality improvement to the creeks and ocean. So I think that's it, and now we have 35 minutes for questions? 40 minutes for questions.
Before we start, though, just one quick thing.
Yeah.
I'm going to interrupt real quickly before we start with questions. I have an evaluation form here, and I think it's really important for everybody to fill it out before you leave today, just to help us figure out, if there were things that were missed or, how we can improve on these kind of workshop presentations. So I'll hand these out. And there's a sign-in sheet somewhere that I sort of lost track of. Who has the sign-in sheet? Okay. Has everybody in this room, I saw a few people show up late, sign in, because if you don't sign the sheet, you won't get your LEAP credit. Everyone has signed in? Okay. So be sure to raise your hand afterwards and have whoever has it here in the back. Brandon can kind of help pass it around. Good. These two in the middle, 3. Okay. So track this down. I'll have it at the front of the room before everybody leaves if you still haven't signed in. And I'll start handing out these evaluation forms. And let's take questions.
One in the back?
Hey, let's go ahead and pass this.
Oh.
I can actually
They're,
pass it around.
I think they're video and audio taping it. So, just so they can hear you.
Testing, hello?
Okay, two of the, we've had a lot of bioswales and things that have been incorporated into projects already. Two of the things that I see out there are, and I think a lot of it's going to be addressed as we start to look at it more, but one of them is the bioswales, number one, are too small for the amount of runoff that's coming in there. The other thing that's happening is that they may be designed with the idea, as we saw in some of your pictures, of this beautiful bog area with the cattails and all of that, but we don't get seasonal rains here. And so for 2 or 3 months, the bog looks great, and then the rest of the year, there's no water going into the thing, and they all die back. So the plant selection hasn't been very good.
Well, those are two good points. So one on the sizing of the systems and the other on plant selection system. And I should say that the manual is intended to prevent that from happening. So by having this manual as a resource now for designers and practitioners in town and project applicants, they can use the resources in here to size their systems properly. There's a lot of information in here on how to size your system based on how much area is running off, and how to select plants appropriately for your systems. So hopefully this is a step in the right direction to addressing those issues.
Hello.
Hi.
I first want to start and just after reviewing the guidance manual, it's a great document, a lot of good technical information in there. My question is more towards implementation, and if, say, in plan check, the city were to receive this site plan saying that, okay, this is what we've done to satisfy the Tier 3 requirements, but what else in addition are you expecting? Because there is the technical data for all the sizing and all of that. Will we, as the city, be requesting to provide all the numbers to show that they've sized it adequately, they've selected the right plants, etc., and what division is responsible for that?
Yeah, probably. If you want, we can discuss an example of. I went through the site plan, but the site plan was accompanied by what was referred to as a preliminary permanent pollution prevention measures analysis. It's essentially an analysis of the runoff quantity and quality from the site, and why certain BMPs were selected and how they're justifying their sizing. And they essentially did some calculations. They document their calculations, their assumptions, and they provide this as a resource for the city. Autumn can describe to what extent various departments are expected to review this, but I should say that what the manual provides are some calculation sheets that look like this, where the applicant, what they did was they actually took our application sheet from the manual, and they documented their calculation to support the fact that their systems were sized properly. But Autumn can talk about responsibility.
Yes, I guess I was curious if that's what we're expecting.
Yeah, that's the main
okay.
thing. I always
Okay.
direct design professionals and the engineers to the appendices. There's worksheets in the back of the manual that actually take you step by step on how to size these best management practices. That's the main thing I look for. But one of the slides that you can find again in your handouts makes it clear that for the Tier 3 requirements, one of the first things we ask for is, yes, we will need a preliminary hydrology or drainage plan. They come by all different names, but basically what it is showing staff what the proposed project is, what the runoff volumes and rates will be post-project, and how they will be addressed by these BMPs. And the worksheets need to be used to show how they're sized and appropriately to meet the volume and rate of the site. So it's just it's a simple plan, and the engineers and design professionals in town are already pretty familiar with this. We've been informally implementing these requirements for the past 3 years, and so development projects and redevelopment projects that have been coming through the city have been having to meet these requirements. They know how to do it, even though they'll kick and scream a little bit. It's pretty basic stuff when you go through the worksheets and use them step by step.
And I guess we can clarify that Creeks Division and the other departments, I don't think you're expected to go through in nitty-gritty detail, double checking all these calculations. I think for me, as someone who designs these systems, as I'm hired by project applicants, I'm putting my PE license on the line when I give calculations, and I sign my name and I stamp it when I stamp the document. So I think you look at that stamp and you look at that signature as support for this information has been checked. I put my name on this document.
And is it okay
Yeah.
if I follow? And then, so in your case, so as the PE, and say after or during construction, are you also are they making you on contract to make sure it's being done per plan?
Well, that's a site-by-site basis, I guess, and
Okay.
it's up to the project applicant if they want to pay for the,
Right.
if they want to just have the design handed to the contractors, and now you put the onus on the contractors to actually build it. So either the designer is going to be there to sign off on the as-built drawing saying it was built per my design, or you're going to have the contractor saying that I'm going to sign off, I completed this work consistent with the design that I was given. So it's on somebody.
So if you weren't hired, it would be up to the building inspectors to make sure that it's per plan. Okay, and then my last question is, say, I don't know, 5 years down the line, do we have another, I know we're just starting to implement this, but would we be revisiting some of these larger, Tier 3 projects to see if it's in?
You mean for follow-up maintenance?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, for a lot of these projects, the way that's been dealt with to date is that there's a conditions of approval, and in those conditions for every project, there is a maintenance and operation plan. And so it's on normally at the property owner or management, if it's an association, to maintain the BMP that's implemented. So that's something that I think is going to evolve as we perfect the stormwater management program, because it is a 5-year plan that has to be revised and updated every 5 years. So maintenance is something that I think we're really going to hone in on and focus in on to make sure that these things are functioning for years and years after they're implemented. But as of now, it's in the conditions of approval and on the shoulders of the property owner or the management of the property.
Okay. And if it was a non-planning commission project, do we have a process yet? Are we working on that? So in plan check, it's a condition
Right.
on the plans? Okay.
Exactly. In plan check, it's
Okay.
we're trying to get those things conditioned and make sure that it's clear that the property owner that's proposing to put it in takes full responsibility.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. You can just pass it on if someone can reach.
I just have a comment. As the city's urban historian, I was glad to see the example of these what they call the Hollywood turf driveway, or what you call a ribbon driveway. Most of our historic neighborhoods are traditional, where the garage is to the back of the site, and it does require a lot of concrete to get back there. So I've tried to encourage those turf driveways as much as I can, but I've been having a lot of resistance from the public because they want the more traditional flat driveway. But so keep fighting for it, because I'll support you.
Okay. Yeah. And they can always go with permeable pavement as well.
Yeah, we get a lot of requests for the tumbled block pavers that have a permeable component to them, but the actual, they didn't have the tumbled block driveways in the 20s, which was when a lot of our bungalow neighborhoods were built. They did have those ribbon driveways, so I like to encourage them as much as possible and continue to do so.
Yeah.
Just a quick yes or no question. When you, on the flow chart, when you refer to planning commission, are you referring to discretionary approvals like staff hearing officer also, or just the planning commission level of a project? Just
Yeah, good question, Kelly. It is very specific. Planning commission approval. So projects that go to planning commission are the ones that get the 3 SWIMP requirements. Discretionary approval for other like show and ABR, that will trigger the 1-inch storm requirements. That's just the water quality requirement. Still considered a discretionary review body, so they still have to implement some element of the SWIMP requirement, and that is laid out in the SWIMP as the water quality requirement, which is capture and treat a 1-inch storm over 24 hours. Mark?
What if it goes to PC on appeal from
The question is, what if it goes to PC on appeal from show, from the staff hearing officer? And the answer is yes. Then it is considered to have planning commission discretionary review, and that triggers the requirements.
So redesign before it goes back to PC.
Well, it depends. If something gets, well, yes. Short answer, yes. What's that? Yeah, the applicant, the whole, I'm glad that question came up, because really the whole idea of these requirements and the whole process that we're trying to get staff familiar with implementing is that the applicants need to be aware of these SWIMP requirements and design guidelines in the very beginning of their project, so that they're implemented, designed correctly, and covered, and that these kind of problems aren't, met down the road. Go ahead.
2 questions for you. On the treatment train concept, I recognize the benefits of it, but my concern is this is a point of concentration of overland flow or anything that's being done. What about the concentration of contaminants that will be building up there? Can the soils handle that? Is there a way of monitoring that?
A good question, and there have been a lot of studies that look at areas that have historically received infiltration over a long period of time from even pretty dense urban areas, industrial areas, commercial areas, and it's extremely rare that the soils that accumulate on the surface, which is where most of the pollutant is filtered by. So the pollutants don't really migrate, so metals are usually the big one. Metals don't really migrate much more than the top 3 to 6 inches. And those most concentrated areas, they'll extremely rarely be characterized as some type of hazardous waste when you need to dispose of it to hazardous waste disposal.
Okay, I was aware that they were very efficient in breaking down contaminants. I just didn't know if there's a
Yeah,
contamination level or saturation point.
Both groundwater and soils are very well protected from these constituents. As you know, soils have natural levels of arsenic and copper and zinc and all other metals. So this is a natural condition. They may be slightly elevated above that natural level, but they're certainly not anything that creates a risk to the ecology or human health.
Super. My other question was the looking at the bioretention idea. I like the concept of using wetlands, but there's a concern. A wetland by the EPA can be anything from a small square patch half the size of this room. And once we create something like that, what happens when some little frog hops along or a salamander comes in? They go, oh, no construction within a half mile.
It's a real that's a real concern. Yeah, and that's I think that's all we can say about it. But that is if endangered species populate the area, then you might have an issue where you're creating habitat for.
So if we have conflicting policies here, and that would be
It's
very
not necessarily
dangerous for a
conflicting.
construction site.
Yeah, it would be if you plan to use that as a different purpose down the road. But if you're planning to keep that area reserved as a wetlands, then there's no reason why the species that now populate it can't be used to continue along that function.
I agree with you, but if you're doing any kind of planning in which you say, all of a sudden we've got a wetland here that we didn't plan on, and I'm in a construction area with plans for building more houses 5 years on my 5-year plan, 2-year plan, whatever, contractor is going to be disappointed.
Yeah.
So is there going to be an effort for a legal contingency for that, or has that even been addressed?
I think it's a good point, and I kind of want to make the point that the city of Santa Barbara is so built out. We through this presentation and then the guidance manual, we have presented all possible BMPs that are popular to date. You know, we could probably even add a few more, but the reality of it is that only a minor few of these, the smaller designs, the smaller BMPs, are ones that actually are implemented and used appropriately on city development or redevelopment projects, because the parcels that we're developing are small individual parcels. There's very few areas where we would actually use a wetland BMP in the city of Santa Barbara because of the minimal area available for that kind of a BMP.
That's for a planned wetland, and I understand that.
Okay.
What happens when it becomes an unplanned wetland?
But I think Autumn's point was that it's very rare that a system will be built, that a wetland system would be used in Santa Barbara. I've designed 4 of them. Our company has designed 4 of them, and they're all used for multiple square mile drainages, very large.
And I agree with you, but again, my question is a little bit more. When you build a treatment train concept, you have the potential for building a wetland there artificially, unknowingly.
Oh, for the treatment drain, not for a wetlands. But you build something that then becomes characterized as a wetlands.
And I know
I think you should be fine there, because when we talk about building infiltration BMPs, through the site assessment process, you're supposed to site them on infiltrative soils, and through the maintenance process, you're maintaining the surface so that it maintains the infiltrative capability. So the ponding that we're talking about here, and there are many reasons why you have incentive to make sure the ponding is very short in duration, is only going to be 24 to 48 hours. Because beyond that, now you're creating a vector issue. So you don't have the opportunity to create a vernal pool or any kind of temporary wetlands. These are systems that are dry. I mean, think about our climate. You have this period of dryness, and these systems are not going to be wetted more than a few days after the rain events. So you're not going to create a wetlands out of a bioretention cell. Yeah, you shouldn't.
It's supposed to be designed to avoid that.
I've seen it happen. I've seen construction sites that can go on for 6-8 months and artificially create a wetland, and then they have an environmental problem that's just nuts.
Yeah, they may have to deal with that.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting point about our climate and how a treatment train might actually look for our climate with a maybe different type of lawn alternative versus the type of lawns we were seeing in the slides. Like maybe it'd be the taller grasses, native grasses or something like that only need water every so often.
Yeah.
Is that about right?
Yeah, I don't think that we have any intention for the treatment trains or bioretention or the rain gardens, any of these systems to be irrigated. There's a temporary period during the vegetation establishment right after seeding that you do want to irrigate to make sure that they have a chance to start. But we've recommended in the manual throughout that you use native plants, and that there's a native plant list in the back of the document that you can use for siting plants on these BMPs. But these BMPs that I described, the cisterns, the rain gardens, the bioretention cells, these have all been designed. There's many examples of swales in arid Southern California conditions.
Yeah, I have a question, sort of like give us a pep talk about implementing these BMPs, and is it a incremental approach, 5 years? Do we expect there to be a noticeable improvement, or is it more like 20 years, really, in reality, since it's incremental?
Yeah, it depends. If this economic climate continues, obviously you're going to have no development, or you're going to have very little development, and so you're not going to have a lot of projects that come through with good water quality benefit. But if you go through a boom period and you've got tons of redevelopment in the downtown area where it's most concentrated urbanization, then you could see some significant improvement over that schedule 5 to 20 years. But I should say stormwater quality variability it's very significant. When we talk about pollutant concentrations in creeks and the ocean, we're talking orders of magnitude. So to tease that out of the data statistically, you're probably not going to be able to have the money to collect enough samples to be able to show 10 years from now that there was improvement because of this program. There's just too much going on, unfortunately. Yeah.
Let me just tag on to that. As far as a pep talk, Jaime was saying, I think that it's also, even when we have slow development, and not a lot of development projects coming through where we can implement these BMPs, I think that what we can do as city staff is at least educate the potential developers who do come in, and applicants asking about, all right, if I wanted to build this, what would I do? Or, hey, I'd like to, get some ideas as to what the project requirements are for my parcel because I want to do this. So what city staff can be doing in the meantime is introducing applicants to the guidance manual and to these concepts. I just recently finished working with some city staff on a homeowner brochure that is a simple handout for the public and for homeowners or small land developers who come in and ask questions, that at least get the knowledge and the awareness out there that these kind of designs and development options are not only required in certain settings, but fairly easy to do depending on the level that you want to implement. So we can get more bang for our buck that way too, hopefully.
Probably, I don't want to end on too much of a down note with my last response. So I should say that I think there will be real water quality benefits that are realized through this program. And for instance, we can just think about it through a back of the envelope type of calculation where, say, in 20 years, 20% of the city's areas have been redeveloped. Maybe that's a little optimistic. Maybe it happens over 50 years. And if each of these systems that are designed reduce the runoff volume by half, okay, which is very feasible, half of the runoff volume is reduced, then that means 10% of your water quantity and 10% of your pollutant load has been reduced to your creeks and ocean. So that's the kind of level or margin of improvement that we're talking about, that we're expecting through this program. And this program is only one of several in the municipality. So this, along with the rest of the tools in your toolbox, are intended to reap benefits down the road, but it may take some time.
I was just heading towards, if we really want to make more of an impact, it would be getting the voluntary compliance and, giving them some type of break on their water bill in order for them to do this stuff, so they don't have to wait for a redevelopment project.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Something like that.
There's a
Is it on? You made a comment about other things going on in the community that can help in the stormwater runoff and water quality concerns, and that's always been I've had many opportunities to ask this, but I'm not sure if I have before. You mentioned at the beginning the NPDES and then the city's SWIMP. I understood that major city facilities like the waterfront and the airport or other major public works facilities in the city are already under, maybe it's
they
the
have
NP.
their own permits.
Yeah. And so I don't know if everyone knows that. On this program, you did list public works projects, and it's not very well defined what we mean by public works projects here in this list. So to me, that was a big question mark, particularly when I understood that major public facilities in the city are already doing a lot of this.
Yeah.
And that would just be good general information for us to all understand. It goes, again, towards what is the organization, the community doing as a whole to improve the water quality.
It's a good point. The NPDES program is the way that the federal government administers and enforces the Clean Water Act. There are many agencies or permittees within the boundaries of the city that are covered under individual NIPDES permits and general NIPDES permits. The city's municipal storm sewer collection system is one of those entities. There are construction sites that are covered under, if they're sizable enough, they're covered under a general statewide construction NIPDES permit. They have to apply for that, and they have to do a stormwater pollution prevention plan to meet those requirements. There are industrial dischargers that, they may not be big enough in the city of Santa Barbara, but they're nearby. They're in Santa Barbara County. They're required to be covered under a statewide or an individual industrial NIPDES permit. Waterfront, they may be an example that has their own NIPDES permit as well as a waterfront entity, like all harbors. And then airports as well. Airport's another good example that I think they're an industrial category, if I understand right, and they need to be covered under an individual or a general statewide NIPDES permit. So there are many permitted agencies in town, and the city is just one of them.
Thanks. My question is about the triggers for the different tiers and whether these sizes are cumulative. So if someone comes in with 490 square foot change to their footprint this year, next year they do another one, and they're kind of just staying right under the radar, is that something we...
If they're separate projects, then they're separate projects. I think they're viewed individually. Yeah. If they want, yeah, don't tell people about it. Yeah. 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 Hopefully they'll be encouraged through you guys and through outreach from the Creeks Department to implement voluntary measures. Mark.
You mentioned that we're not expected to really look at the calculations and the design very closely.
You might be an
because,
exception.
Well, there'll be a stamp of a civil engineer on there for us. Is that expected for all tiers or just maybe tier 3?
That's just tier 3 probably.
So who fills out tier 1 and 2? Just the applicant or an architect?
Well, tier 1's voluntary. And then tier 2, an example that I gave, if you remember, it was a simple drawing, a site plan that just showed I'm implementing a BMP here. So tier 2 is, I guess, through the DART process, they'll review the site plan and approve it. I think that's a very simple process. They're not sized.
Right, yeah. Tier 2 projects only have basic BMP requirements. There's no sizing requirement. So it's basically just going through the list in Chapter 5 and saying, okay, this BMP looks appropriate to my site because I have infiltrative soils and I don't have a steep slope, or I have a steep slope and I have D soils, so I need to choose this rain barrel. But it's basically just a process of picking one of the appropriate BMPs from Chapter 5 and checking it off and showing it on your site plan that, yes, I've implemented one or more basic BMPs, and that is it. That's where the requirement ends.
There's no way to ensure that it's sized appropriately.
But on tier 3, you've got to have a civil engineered set of plans before you go to planning commission?
Yes.
It's a good distinction.
And are you going to have another seminar for engineers?
Yes. So it's good. We have 2 more seminars planned for practitioners and engineering folks in town. Will that be open to, we don't have dates, but will that be open to city staff as well if they want to? So I guess, yeah, could be open to engineering folks.
Wow. Usually they have nuts on the top. Who's got sign-in sheet?
There's a sign-in sheet you're looking for?
Yeah. And my question with respect to NPDS BMPs, how do we ensure in our projects that you can record or get credit for it during the annual report? You do an annual report?
Yes.
And part of the annual report requirements is taking credit for the BMPs and stormwater work that you do in that report. How do we ensure that you get that information?
Okay, good question. Yeah, he's right. The stormwater management plan, now that it's being formally implemented, requires an annual report at the end of each calendar year. the stormwater management programs on a calendar year. So as the administrator of the SWIMP, I've been coordinating with all of the different managers and supervisors of the different departments and divisions of the city, and making it really clear as to which BMPs in the SWIMP different divisions are responsible for. And I'm getting quarterly reports from these managers and supervisors showing me how each BMP is being met. So it's basically a tracking effort. We have to track certain activities that each department and division does throughout the year, and then record it quarterly and send it to me so I can compile an annual report. So that's an important requirement now that we're having to coordinate. Questions? Come back over there.
Why are we making the pregnant woman walk around?
Hey, you know what? I need exercise.
Thanks. Just a question about where all these resources are located so we can direct people. I assume they're on our website, just trying to get the information out there.
Yeah. So these SWIMP, Stormwater Management Program, and the BMP Guidance Manual are both posted on the Community Development website under Guidelines. So that's kind of a logical place to look for it. It's guidelines. You only have to click twice. I think you go to the city website, you click on Community Development, then you click on Guidelines, and it's listed in there. So both documents are also listed on our Creeks website. And an easy way to get to that website, rather than clicking through the city's website, is just to do www.sbcreeks.org. And there's a link about halfway down the page that says Stormwater Management Program. You click on that link, and both the SWIMP and the Guidance Manual are PDF documents available there. Is it on? Go ahead and check if it's on. That's when the phone rings, I guess, is when it's on.
It's Big Brother over there.
Big Brother's out there, right? So I'm one of the public works inspectors, so I come across a lot of people who are putting in curb drain outlets. And I would like to actually have them volunteer to put in some sort of detention basin on the property and keeping the curb drain as an overflow, possibly, for that particular project. How can I encourage them, and I'm talking mom and pop or small developments, to be a volunteer for this particular thing? And where would they get that information? From that same website? Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely provide them with the website links. We have the new brochure that I mentioned earlier that is available through Community Development. That's an easy threefold brochure that sort of describes the simple things that you're talking about. And yeah, don't be afraid. I think as city staff, it's part of our responsibility to start to get these concepts accepted by the general public, because they are becoming requirements that the state is holding on us. So, speak freely as far as trying to get these things promoted. Don't hesitate.
The manual now is a resource.
Yeah. sbcreeks.org.
Great. Thanks, everybody.